Hello, everybody. This is Menopause Taylor bringing you the state of menopause in the world today. I'm giving you tutorials on gynecologic matters and menopause matters and gynecologic matters that affect your menopause. This is the second of three podcasts that I'm giving you on fibroids. The first one was last week, and it was on what are fibroids. I just explained what they are on that podcast. In this one, I'm going to tell you the effect of menopause on your fibroids. And the next one will address whether or not you can take HRT if you have fibroids. Now, my education, my podcast, my videos, everything I do requires you to watch the stuff or listen to the stuff or read the stuff in order, because if you don't, you're just not going to understand anything. So I'm always going to be here waiting for you when you're ready for the next thing. So just get the stuff that comes before this first. It's critical to your understanding. So if you have already listened to the podcast before this one, or watched the video or read the book or whatever on what are fibroids, then you're ready for. Here's a quick review of what you've already learned. Fibroids are overgrowths of the fibrous tissue in the muscle of your uterus. And they start out very, very small, and they grow in response to estrogen. They're very common. They're present in 40 to 50% of women. And most women who have fibroids have multiple fibroids, many of them, rather than just one. As they grow slowly over your reproductive years, they deform your uterus from a perfectly normal shaped upside down pear into something that looks kind of bizarre, multi-lobed and bulbous and irregular. So, because estrogen is what causes fibroids to grow, we're now addressing the effect of menopause on your fibroids. And if you recall way back to the podcast on female hormones, I taught you a long time ago how estrogen and progesterone produce your menstrual cycles. And what you have is kind of a dance between estrogen and progesterone. Every time you have a menstrual cycle, the first half of every single cycle that you have over the course of your lifetime involves high estrogen in the first half of your cycle. And the second half of every single cycle you have over the course of your reproductive life involves high progesterone. So every month, when your estrogen is high, the fibrous tissue in your uterus can get stimulated and start growing into a fibroid. And then, every month after that, the estrogen can cause that fibroid to grow just a little bit more. Now, does that make estrogen bad? You see, this is the kind of thing that induced the alternative and complementary community to come up with the term estrogen dominance. And just the sound of that makes you think of estrogen as the bad guy. But estrogen is also the hormone that does a whole lot of good things. Estrogen is responsible for your soft skin, your sexy curvy figure, your shiny hair, your moist vagina, your dense bones, your healthy heart, your witty brain, your absence of whiskers, and much more. One of the things you'll hear again and again in my educational products is that nothing is perfect. Everything has some advantages and disadvantages. So estrogen is no different. So yes, estrogen makes fibroids grow, but it also does some of the things you value most about being female. If you wanted to avoid everything estrogen does, you would have to either be male or dead. So, after having cycle after cycle after cycle, month after month after month, you get pregnant. And what happens with estrogen then? It skyrockets. Estrogen increases to 35 times its non-pregnant level And guess how much larger your uterus gets during pregnancy? It increases to 1,000 times its pre-pregnancy size. Now, with all that estrogen and the great increase in the size of your uterus, your fibroids are going to grow. So it's not uncommon for fibroids to grow significantly during pregnancy. And usually, they don't shrink after the pregnancy. Now, of course, fibroids can cause problems during the pregnancy too. If you add up all the estrogen stimulation of fibroids over the course of a normal reproductive life, including a few pregnancies, you can see why they can get fairly big. But the key is to understand that they usually grow slowly and steadily. Rapid growth of fibroids is a whole different ballgame, or it could be a whole different diagnosis. Okay, so we so far have covered your reproductive life of cycles and pregnancies. Let's move on to the next phase of your life, perimenopause. Now this is the transition between your reproductive life and your post-menopausal life. And what's the hormonal change that causes perimenopause? Do you remember? I've mentioned it in a bunch of podcasts and in all my videos. I mention it all the time. It's low progesterone. So if your progesterone drops, but your estrogen stays normal, what do you have? You have what some call estrogen dominance. And again, it's not a bad thing. It's just a temporary phase. But the estrogen causes your fibroids to grow. Not only that, perimenopause is when your periods get really wacky. So that's when you have the most trouble with bleeding from fibroids, which is the most common symptom of fibroids. Now, because of this situation at perimenopause, this is when most women have the most trouble with their fibroids. That's why you hear so many women say that they had some kind of treatment for their fibroids when they were in their 40s. So now, let's take that and contrast it with what happens next at post-menopause. So I just told you that estrogen production during your cycles and pregnancies causes fibroids to grow. What happens to your estrogen at post-menopause? You stop producing estrogen, so your estrogen drops. So what's going to happen to your fibroids? Don't get carried away now. You just learned that your fibroids do not shrink after pregnancy when your estrogen levels decrease by 35 times. So don't jump the gun and say that they disappear at postmenopause. They don't. But they do stop growing. Their fuel disappears. So usually once you become postmenopausal, your fibroids stop growing. But you know, there's a difference between cessation of growth and shrinkage. In the last tutorial, I taught you that the most common symptom of fibroids is bleeding. Usually, it's heavy periods or bleeding between periods. So, at postmenopause, when you stop having your periods, you stop having the bleeding that's associated with fibroids. Another symptom of fibroids is pelvic pain. Now, pelvic pain, the reason that fibroids are associated with pelvic pain is because your uterus is a muscle and it contracts in order to stop the bleeding. A contraction of your uterine muscle is a cramp, and a uterine cramp is pelvic pain. And if there's no bleeding for your uterus to stop, the pelvic pain usually ceases at postmenopause too. So you've got bleeding and pelvic pain that can go away at postmenopause. Well, what's the other symptom of fibroids? Well, it's pelvic pressure. Now, that's the pressure of those heavy, heavy, big fibroids pushing down on your pelvis. Do you think that goes away too? Of course not. Your fibroids stop growing, but they don't shrink. It's not like they lose weight. So for most women, postmenopause brings about desirable changes in their fibroids, but it does not make them disappear. In essence, what you have is this. In your 20s and 30s, fibroids develop and grow very slowly. Each pregnancy makes them grow significantly. Perimenopause makes them bleed a lot. And postmenopause makes them stop growing but does not solve pelvic pressure. So if you can get through your 20s and 30s without your fibroids getting too big, and if you can get through your perimenopausal 40s without your fibroids causing too much bleeding, your postmenopause should bring you some peace with regard to your fibroids. So do you see how all this makes sense? Understanding the facts makes everything so much easier. You know what's going on, you know what to expect, and you know your options. But wait, I taught you all about the estrogen window of opportunity. You learned that loss of estrogen has some disastrous effects on your body. And in this podcast, you've learned that loss of estrogen has some wonderful effects on your fibroids. You see, everything has both advantages and disadvantages. And the next question becomes, well, can you or should you take HRT if you have fibroids? Don't you just love the way every new piece of knowledge prompts new questions? This is what I love about education. So in the next podcast, what I'm going to do is address the question, can you take HRT if you have fibroids? You see, that's how it works. You keep building piece by piece by piece. Every time you learn something, it poses another question that you then have to go answer. And I just teach you in a very systematic, step-by-step way that makes it very easy for you to understand why everything is the way it is or why the facts are as they are. Because if you learn this stuff in order, it makes sense. If you're jumping all around in any willy-nilly order, which I don't understand in the first place, but a lot of people do things that way, you'll never learn anything because all you get is bits and pieces, and there's never any cohesive, logical sequence of events that help you create logic. Knowing one little piece of information isn't very useful to you. What you need is to be able to think through things. So now you understand why so many women end up going to emergency rooms with super heavy bleeding in their 40s. What's happened is they've had fibroids growing slowly all the years of their 20s and 30s. They get into their 40s. They become perimenopausal. Their progesterone disappears. Their periods get really wacky. And those wacky periods in the context of fibroids causes heavy, heavy bleeding that can't be controlled because your uterus can't contract because the fibroids are in the way. It makes perfect sense. This is a very common scenario. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of women who have, horror stories of going to the emergency room with heavy bleeding. Now, what happens? Well, it depends on the situation. Sometimes the bleeding just stops. Sometimes they need a transfusion. Sometimes they need surgery. Every situation is different. The point is, if you understand what's going on, and if you get exams periodically and you know how big your uterus is and you know whether or not it's